Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back more than 3,000 years to the banks of the Nile, where the air shimmers with heat and something sweeter. Frankincense smoke curling from temple braziers, lotus petals crushed between fingertips, myrrh oil glistening on the throat of a woman who knows that fragrance is power. You're standing barefoot on sun-warmed limestone in ancient Thebes, and the world around you smells like heaven distilled into earthenware jars. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why we still associate certain scents with luxury, or why a single whiff of perfume can unlock memories you thought you'd forgotten. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, whether you're tucked under blankets in Oslo or listening to rain on a tin roof in Jakarta. Maybe you've got a favourite perfume yourself, something your grandmother wore or a scent that takes you back to a specific summer. I'd love to hear about it. Now let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. The sun hasn't fully risen yet. You can see it bleeding pink and gold along the eastern horizon, turning the Nile into a ribbon of molten copper. You're in the inner courtyard of Hathor's temple, and your bare feet whisper across tiles still cool from the night. Around you, other women move in practiced silence, some carrying shallow bowls of water, others cradling bundles of dried herbs that crackle softly when they walk. You're one of them now, a perfume priestess, though the title sounds grander than the work. Your hands smell permanently of cedarwood, and your fingernails carry crescents of dark resin that no amount of scrubbing fully removes. This morning, you've been assigned to prepare kaifi, the sacred incense that will burn tonight when the high priestess performs the evening ritual. It's not your first time making it, but every batch feels like a small act of alchemy. 16 ingredients. 40 days of preparation if you do it properly, though you're working with a batch someone else started weeks ago. You kneel beside a low table scattered with mortars, pestles and small linen bags tied with twine. The chief perfumer, an older woman named Mariette whose eyes are perpetually red from decades of smoke, gestures for you to begin grinding the dried juniper berries. You pick up the pestle, smooth stone palm-worn by generations of hands, and start working the berries in slow circles. The scent releases immediately, sharp and clean, cutting through the heavier sweetness that always hangs in this room. Mariette doesn't watch you closely. She trusts you've learned by now. Instead, she's bent over a clay pot, stirring something viscous and amber-coloured that smells like honey mixed with wine and something darker, earthier. Raisins, you remember. Soaked in red wine for 7 days, then mashed into paste. Here's something historians still argue about: whether kaifi was primarily a religious offering, or if it doubled as an ancient form of aromatherapy, deliberately designed to alter consciousness. The recipes we've found, and yes, actual recipes survived on temple walls and papyrus scrolls, contain ingredients known to have mild psychoactive properties when burned. Calamus root, for instance, which some scholars suggest could induce mild euphoria. Blue lotus, which definitely did. The Egyptians weren't naive about these things. They understood that scent could change your state of mind, could make you feel closer to the divine, or simply help you forget that your back ached from hauling water all morning. You move on to the myrrh resin next, breaking apart the hardened amber chunks before grinding them. Myrrh was imported from Punt, modern-day Somalia, or perhaps Yemen, depending on which expert you ask, and it cost more than most families earned in a year. Just holding it makes you conscious of value. of the trade routes stretching across desert and sea to bring this gum to your fingers. When you were younger, you once asked Mariette why the gods needed expensive gifts. She laughed, a sound like papyrus tearing, and said, "The gods don't need anything, child, but we need to give them the best we have. That's how we remember what matters." The temple courtyard fills with morning light, and you can hear the city waking beyond the walls, vendors shouting, donkeys braying, the eternal splash and murmur of the river. But inside here, time moves differently. You're measuring out pine resin now, sticky stuff that clings to your fingers and smells like distant forests you've never seen. Egypt isn't known for pine trees. This resin came from somewhere north, from lands where, rumour has it, winter turns rain into frozen white crystals. You can't imagine it. The traders who bring these materials tell stories so outrageous you assume they're lying. But the evidence sits right here in your palm, proof that the world is larger and stranger than the Nile Valley that contains your entire existence. Mariette adds cinnamon bark to her mixture, and suddenly the whole room smells like something almost edible, though you know better than to taste any of this. Some of the ingredients are toxic in concentration. Cassia, for instance, which looks and smells like cinnamon's rougher cousin. Safe in incense, less so in your stomach. The Egyptians were surprisingly sophisticated about chemistry, even if they didn't call it that. They understood extraction, distillation, fermentation. They knew that some plants gave up their scent easily in oil, while others required wine or milk to release their essence. You work in comfortable silence for a while. The only sounds the grinding of stone on stone, and the occasional instruction from Mariette. Then she tells you something you didn't know. Kifi was also used as medicine. Mixed with wine, it supposedly cured liver ailments. Applied as a salve, it treated wounds. Burned and inhaled, it eased breathing problems and helped insomniacs sleep. The same substance that carried prayers to Hathor also served intensely practical purposes. The Egyptians didn't separate sacred and useful the way we do. Everything holy was also functional, and everything functional had the potential to be holy. By the time you finish your portion of the work, the sun has climbed high enough to pour heat into the courtyard like liquid. Sweat traces lines down your spine beneath your linen sheath dress. Mariette carefully scrapes your ground ingredients into a larger bowl, mixing them with her wine-soaked raisins, honey, and a dozen other components you'll add over the coming days. The mixture will sit in a cool, dark room, stirred daily, transformed slowly by time and fermentation into something greater than the sum of its parts. It's a little like raising a child, you think, or aging wine, or any act of patient creation. Before you leave the workshop, Mariette presses a tiny clay jar into your hands. Inside is a sample of last month's kai-fi, solidified into a waxy pellet. For your own prayers, she says. You close your fingers around it, feeling the weight of the gift. Tonight, in your small room, you'll burn this, and the smoke will carry your thoughts upward. Though whether anyone's listening you honestly don't know, but the scent will make you feel less alone, and maybe that's prayer enough. You step out of the temple workshop into the full blaze of midday, and the heat wraps around you like a physical thing, thick and insistent. The streets of Thebes pulse with life, merchants hawking clay lamps, children darting between adults' legs, the perpetual smell of baking bread mixing with dust and donkey dung. But you're still thinking about Hathor, the goddess whose temple you just left, whose presence seems to linger in the perfume oil still coating your forearms. If you're going to understand why Egyptian women devoted so much time and resources to fragrance, you need to understand her first. Hathor isn't just a goddess. She's the goddess, at least when it comes to anything involving beauty, love, music, and yes, scent. You've seen her image 1,000 times. A woman with a cow's horns cradling the sun disk, or sometimes just as a cow, massive and gentle, her eyes painted with elaborate kohl. The Greeks would later associate her with Aphrodite, but that comparison misses something essential. Hathor is wilder, more dangerous, more complex. She's the goddess of drunkenness and hangovers, of sexual pleasure and childbirth pain, of perfume and the violence that sometimes comes with desire. She contains multitudes, as they say, and the Egyptians loved her for it. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Hathor was considered the divine perfumer, and women offered her incense and scented oils in exchange for her blessings. Temple records show that her priestesses were among the most skilled perfume makers in Egypt, and their workshops produced not just religious incense, but also commercial products sold throughout the Mediterranean world. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera, you've never been there but you've heard descriptions, contained entire rooms dedicated to perfume production, with stone tables for grinding, storage jars lining the walls, and detailed recipes carved into the stone itself. Archaeologists would later find these recipes still legible after millennia, a testament to how important the Egyptians considered this knowledge. But why perfume specifically? Why did Hathor care about smell? The answer lies in Egyptian theology, which you've absorbed not through formal teaching but through years of temple service and whispered stories. The Egyptians believed that gods could be physically present through scent. When you burned kefir or anointed yourself with lotus oil, you weren't just making a symbolic gesture, you were creating a pathway for divine essence to enter the mortal world. Fragrance was a bridge between realms, and Hathor was the goddess who walked that bridge most readily. You remember a story Mariette once told you, late at night when the workshop was empty and the oil lamps made shadows dance on the walls. In this story, the sun god Ra grows old and angry, convinced that humanity has grown disrespectful and needs to be destroyed. He sends Hathor, in her form as Sekhmet the lioness, to slaughter mankind. And she does, enthusiastically, wading through blood with a terrible joy. Ra realizes he's made a mistake and needs to stop her, but Sekhmet won't listen to reason. So he resorts to trickery. He orders 7,000 jars of beer brewed and mixed with red ochre to look like blood, then pours it across the land. Sekhmet drinks deeply, thinking it's more human blood, and gets so drunk she transforms back into gentle Hathor and forgets about the genocide. It's a weird story, right? But it tells you something crucial about how Egyptians understood their goddess. Hathor contains both the nurturing and the destructive. She's intoxication, literal and metaphorical. And here's where it gets interesting for our purposes. In many versions of the tale, it's not just beer that transforms her, it's perfume. The beer is scented with mandrake and lotus, and it's the fragrance that soothes her rage, that calls her back to her gentler nature. Scent has the power to change fundamental nature, to reach into rage and extract peace. Historians still argue whether Hathor worship involved actual temple prostitution, or if that's a misunderstanding of religious rituals that the Greeks later misinterpreted. What's clear is that her temples were places where women came to pray for sexual fulfillment, for successful pregnancies, for beauty that would attract or keep a lover. And they brought perfume as offerings, always. Small jars of scented oil, cones of incense, fresh flowers that would wilt within hours, but whose fragrance would linger in the temple air. You've participated in the Festival of Drunkenness, held annually in Hathor's honour. For one night, all social rules relax. Everyone drinks beer and wine until they can barely stand. Musicians play drums and rattles. The sistrum is sacred to Hathor, its metallic jingle said to repel evil spirits and attract divine favour. Women and men alike anoint themselves with expensive perfumes they've saved all year to afford, and the whole city becomes a cloud of fragrance and music and laughter. In the morning you wake with a pounding headache and a vague sense of having danced with someone whose face you can't quite remember, and the temple priestesses move through the crowds offering a hangover cure made from, you guessed it, perfumed oils pressed against the temples and wrists. Here's the quirky tidbit. Hathor was particularly associated with turquoise, a stone the Egyptians mined in the Sinai and valued almost as highly as gold. Her priestesses wore turquoise jewellery, and the cosmetic eye paint worn in her honour often contained ground turquoise mixed with fat. When you've prepared perfumes for her festivals, you've sometimes added a tiny amount of turquoise powder to the mix, not enough to change the scent, but enough to make the offering more pleasing to her. It seems almost magical, this idea that a goddess has favourite colours and smells, that she can be courted like a difficult friend with the right gifts. But what did women actually pray for when they offered perfume to Hathor? You know from experience, they prayed for love. Yes, but more specifically, that their husband would continue to desire them after childbirth changed their bodies, that a potential lover would notice them in a crowded marketplace, that their skin would stay smooth and their breath sweet, that they wouldn't grow old and invisible, forgotten, dismissed. Perfume was a tool of visibility, a way of saying, I exist, I matter, I am here. And Hathor, who understood desire in all its complicated glory, was the perfect divine patron for these deeply human concerns. You've also seen women pray to her for things that have nothing to do with romance. For the courage to leave an abusive husband, less common than you'd hope, but it happens. For the milk to continue flowing when they're nursing a sick infant. For relief from the crushing depression that sometimes follows childbirth, when joy should reign, but instead there's only grey emptiness. Hathor hears these prayers too. She's not just about pleasure. She's about surviving the full spectrum of female experience, the blood and milk and tears of it, not just the perfumed banquet halls. The theological complexity here gets overlooked sometimes. Hathor isn't a simple goddess of love. She's a goddess of intensity. Whatever you're feeling, she can amplify it or transform it. And scent became her medium because scent works that way too. A smell can transport you across decades in an instant, can change your mood more rapidly than almost any other sense. The Egyptians understood this intuitively. They didn't need neuroscience to tell them that the olfactory system connects directly to the limbic system, to the brain's emotional centres. They just knew that smell was powerful magic. Before you head home, you stop at a small shrine, barely more than a niche in a wall with Hathor's image painted inside, her cow ears gentle, her eyes knowing. Someone has left fresh lotus flowers, already beginning to wilt in the heat. You touch your fingers to your lips, then to the painted stone, and whisper a prayer you've said 100 times. Lady of Perfume, let me be remembered sweetly. It's what all of us want, really. To leave a pleasant scent in the memories of those who knew us. To be associated with beauty rather than decay. Hathor knows this about humans, and she doesn't judge us for it. She simply offers the tools, perfume, music, love, intoxication, and lets us choose how to use them. You're back in the temple workshop 3 days later, and Marriott is showing you something that looks like thick, dark honey, but smells like every mysterious forest and exotic spice market compressed into a single jar. This is Kefi in its nearly finished form, and you're watching 40 days of patient work reach its conclusion. The mixture has fermented, darkened, developed complexity the way wine does with age. Mariette lets you stir it, and your wooden paddle moves through the paste with satisfying resistance, releasing waves of fragrance that make your head feel pleasantly light, almost floaty. This is the part they don't put in the temple records, how the perfume makers themselves get a little drunk on their own creations, how you spend enough time around Kefi and suddenly your anxieties seem less pressing, your sleep deeper, your dreams stranger. Kefi is arguably ancient Egypt's most famous perfume, and for good reason. While other cultures were still figuring out that burning things could smell nice, the Egyptians had perfected a 16-ingredient recipe that required more skill than most people apply to their entire careers. You've memorized the components by now. Myrrh, juniper berries, frankincense, cinnamon, calamus, pine resin, cassia, wine, honey, raisins, rush, cardamom, mint, bitumen, and 2 others that vary depending on which temple you're working in. Some recipes call for cypress, others add spikenard. The exact proportions are trade secrets, passed down through generations of perfumers who understand that the difference between average and transcendent is sometimes just a 1/4 ounce of one ingredient over another. Here's what the historical record tells us. Kefi wasn't just incense. The Greek historian Plutarch wrote about it centuries later, describing how Egyptians burned it in the evening as a form of relaxation therapy. The recipe he recorded matches reasonably well with the formulas carved in temple walls at Edfu and Philae, suggesting that the tradition remained relatively consistent across centuries. The name itself probably derives from the Egyptian word kap, meaning to perfume or fumigate. By the time Kefi reached Greece and Rome, it had become a luxury item sold in the markets of Athens and Alexandria, purchased by wealthy foreigners who wanted a piece of Egyptian mysticism in their homes. But here's the quirky part that gets less attention. Kefi was marketed as a sleep aid and dream enhancer. Egyptian medical texts, the kind written on papyrus and tucked into physicians' bags, prescribe it for insomnia, recommending that patients burn it in their bedrooms before sleep. And not just any sleep, but sleep filled with prophetic dreams. The Egyptians took dreams seriously. They believed dreams were messages from the gods, glimpses of the future, or sometimes just your dead relatives checking in to make sure you were keeping up with the family tomb maintenance. A perfume that could make dreams more vivid, more memorable, more interpretable. That was valuable beyond simple luxury. That was a tool for navigating both the mortal world and the realms beyond it. You've experienced it yourself, on nights when you've burned Kefi in your small room, a privilege of working in the temple, getting access to scraps and samples the priestesses don't need. Your dreams have been unusually vivid, not necessarily pleasant, but memorable. You've dreamed of walking through gardens that don't exist, of conversations with your dead mother that feel more real than memories, of warnings about people you should avoid or opportunities you should pursue. Whether the Kefi actually causes this, or whether you're simply more attentive to your dreams when you burn it, you can't say. Does it matter? The outcome is the same. Mariette lets you help form the finished Kefi into small cones, each one shaped by hand and left to dry on linen cloth spread across the work table. Your fingers grow black with the paste, and the scent soaks into your skin so thoroughly you'll smell like Kefi for days. Other perfumers will recognize it immediately. It's like a professional signature, proof that you're working on the sacred batches rather than the common incense sold in the marketplaces. There's a hierarchy even in perfume work. The women who make Kefi for temples occupy a higher status than those who produce simple lotus oil or cheap myrrh paste for embalming. Historians still argue whether the psychoactive properties of Kai-Fi were intentional or just a happy accident. The Blue Lotus in particular contains apomorphine and nuciferine, compounds that produce mild euphoria and, in higher doses, sedation and altered consciousness. The Egyptians depicted Blue Lotus everywhere. In tomb paintings, on temple walls, carved into furniture. Noble women are shown holding lotus flowers to their noses at banquets, and scholars debate whether this was purely decorative or whether they were essentially getting high at dinner parties. The smart money is on both. The Egyptians enjoyed beauty for its own sake, but they also appreciated substances that made them feel good. Calamus root, another Kifi ingredient, has similar properties. Modern testing shows it contains acerone, which in sufficient quantities produces stimulant and potentially hallucinogenic effects. The Egyptians wouldn't have known the chemical names, but they certainly understood the effects. They weren't naive. They'd been working with mind-altering substances for thousands of years. Opium from poppies, mandrake for pain relief, various herbs for everything from contraception to inducing labour. The idea that they accidentally created a psychoactive incense strain's credibility. More likely they knew exactly what they were doing and considered altered consciousness a feature, not a bug. You watch Marriott burn a test cone, evaluating the scent as it rises in grey-blue coils toward the ceiling. She closes her eyes, breathes deeply, nods with satisfaction. This batch is good. It'll be distributed to the evening rituals throughout the month, burned while priestesses sing hymns to Hathor and Ra, while petitioners bring their prayers and offerings, while the temple transitions from day to night, and the boundary between mortal and divine grows thin. The scent of Kai-Fi marks that transition, signals to everyone breathing it that normal rules are temporarily suspended, that in this perfume darkness anything might happen. Before you finish for the day, Marriott tells you a story you haven't heard before. She says that in the old days, and she means the really old days, back when the pyramids were new and the kings still thought they'd live forever, the recipe for Kifi was different. More ingredients, stranger ones. She's heard rumours of versions that included small amounts of crocodile musk, or powdered scarab beetles, or even drops of menstrual blood from virgin priestesses. You must make a face because she laughs, that dry papyrus sound again. Don't look so shocked, she says. People have always believed that adding something of yourself to perfume makes it more powerful. Your essence in the essence. You can't tell if she's joking or passing on genuine tradition. With Marriott, it's always hard to tell. But you think about it as you walk home through the evening streets, past vendors closing up their stalls and mothers calling children inside. The idea that perfume could contain pieces of the people who made it, that every jar of scented oil or cone of incense carries invisible traces of the hands that prepared it, the prayers spoken over it, the intentions kneaded into it like bread dough. Maybe that's why perfume feels so personal, why the right scent can feel like meeting an old friend while the wrong one makes your skin crawl. That night, you burn a tiny piece of Kifi before bed, and you dream of gardens, always gardens, lush and impossible, filled with flowers that don't exist and trees that bear fruit in colours you've never seen. In the dream, Hathor walks among the plants, not as a cow or a woman, but as pure presence, and when she passes, flowers bloom and release perfume so intense it becomes visible, like coloured smoke. You try to ask her something, some question that feels desperately important, but before you can speak you wake up, the dream already fading, leaving you with nothing but the lingering scent of Kifi, and a vague sense that you've been told something crucial that you're not quite ready to understand. Section 4, you're at the harbour before dawn, watching the cargo ships arrive from the south, and the air already smells different here. Saltier from the river meeting distant sea, sharper with the tang of foreign goods being unloaded onto wooden docks that creak with every wave. You're not here for pleasure. Marriott sent you to meet a trader she's worked with for years, a leathery man from Punt who brings frankincense and myrrh directly from the source, bypassing the middlemen who would triple the price by the time these resins reached Thebes. The perfume business runs on relationships like this, on knowing who to trust when a year's supply of temple incense depends on the quality of tree sap, harvested 1,000 miles away by people you'll never meet. These ships themselves are beautiful in a utilitarian way, broad-bellied vessels with single sails, their hulls painted with protective symbols and prayers to keep river demons at bay. Sailors move across the decks like dancers, their movements efficient and synchronized from years of practice. You watch them unload amphoras of wine, bundles of ivory tusks, leopard skins rolled and tied, caged monkeys chittering in distress, and then, finally, the thing you're here for, wooden crates packed with chunks of golden brown resin that catch the early light and seem to glow from within. Frankincense, the scent of gods and kings, literally worth its weight in gold. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The ancient Egyptians imported massive quantities of frankincense and myrrh from the land of Punt, which modern scholars place somewhere along the Red Sea coast of Somalia, Eritrea, or Yemen. The journey was dangerous enough that successful expeditions were commemorated on temple walls. Queen Hatshepsut, who ruled Egypt as pharaoh despite being born female, which honestly still feels radical even in your time, sent a famous expedition to Punt around 1470 BCE. The relief carvings at her mortuary temple show ships loaded with myrrh trees in pots, frankincense in baskets, and even live frankincense trees being transported to plant in Egyptian soil. It didn't work, incidentally. The trees died. Some plants belong only to their native ground, no matter how powerful the pharaoh who desires them. The trader spots you and waves, grinning to show teeth stained dark from years of chewing cut leaves. His name is something you can't properly pronounce, so everyone calls him Baki, which means olive in Egyptian, a nickname whose origin has been lost to time. He claps you on the shoulder like you're old friends rather than business associates who've met maybe 3 times. Marriott sent the young one, he says not unkindly. She trusts you then. Good. Means I can trust you too. Come, look at what I brought. Best frankincense you'll smell this year, I guarantee it. He pries open one of the crates, and the smell hits you immediately. Clean, slightly lemony, with an underlying sweetness that makes you think of honey and pine at once. You pick up a chunk, turning it in your fingers. Good frankincense should be pale yellow to amber, translucent when you hold it to the light, with minimal bark contamination. This meets all those criteria. You scrape a tiny piece with your thumbnail and bring it to your nose. The scent intensifies, and you detect the subtle complexity that marks superior quality. Not just one note, but layers, the way a good wine has depth. Where did this come from, you ask, because origin matters. Frankincense from different regions has different characteristics, and temple perfumers are particular about their sources. Northern Punt, Baki says, from the Boswellia sacra trees on the mountain slopes. The harvesters bleed the trees 5 times during the season. You can see the quality in the resin colour. First harvest is too soft, last harvest too dark. This is 3rd and 4th harvest. Perfect balance. He's proud, and he should be. You're looking at a product that represents months of labour by people working in conditions you can barely imagine. climbing trees in heat that makes Thebes feel temperate, collecting sap that will travel by donkey to the coast, by ship across dangerous waters, through customs officials who all want their cut, and finally to your hands in this harbour at dawn. Here's the quirky bit that doesn't make it into most history books. The frankincense trade was so valuable that it spawned an entire genre of lies and misinformation designed to protect sources and inflate prices. Greek and Roman writers recorded that frankincense trees were guarded by flying serpents that had to be driven off with burning storax resin. Other accounts claim the trees grew in valleys filled with poisonous snakes, or that the harvesters had to perform elaborate rituals to appease angry tree spirits. Pure fiction, of course, spread by traders who wanted to justify their prices and protect their monopolies. The real danger was more mundane: heat, bandits, political instability, and the simple risk of ships sinking in storms. Becky shows you the myrrh next, darker and more irregular in shape than the frankincense. Myrrh is harder to harvest. The trees are smaller, thornier, more aggressive about protecting their sap. The resin itself is more medicinal smelling, slightly bitter, with notes of earth and licorice. You've always found myrrh more complicated than frankincense, less immediately pleasant but more interesting, like the difference between a smile and a knowing look. Myrrh doesn't ask to be liked, it demands respect. "You know why this costs so much?" Barkey asks, not waiting for an answer. "Not just because of distance, because of waste. For every pound of good resin I bring you, 3 pounds stay in punt. Wrong quality, contaminated, broken down by heat. Then I lose more on the journey. Then your customs officials help themselves. By the time we negotiate, I've already lost half my investment, and I haven't even made a profit yet. You understand the economics, even if they frustrate you. Marriott has taught you to think like a business owner, not just a perfumer. Every jar of sacred kaifi you make contains materials that have passed through dozens of hands, crossed thousands of miles, survived storms and thieves and the arbitrary whims of corrupt officials. The fact that perfume exists at all feels like a miracle, a testimony to human stubbornness and the deep desire to make the world smell better than it naturally does. Historians still argue about whether the frankincense and myrrh trade created the first global economy, or if other commodities like tin and copper deserve that honour. What's undeniable is that by the time you're standing at this harbour, the perfume trade has created networks of exchange spanning 3 continents. A woman in Thebes can wear a scent composed of frankincense from Somalia, cinnamon from India, cedar from Lebanon, and rose oil from Syria. Her perfume is a map of the known world, and she probably doesn't even think about it when she dabs it behind her ears before a dinner party. You negotiate with Barkey, gently, because Marriott has taught you that maintaining relationships matters more than winning any single transaction. You agree on a price that's fair to both sides, arrange for delivery to the temple workshop, and seal the deal with a small cup of terrible wine that Baki pulls from somewhere in his robes. It's a ritual, this drink, older than either of you. Trade has always been about more than simple exchange. It's about trust, about betting that the person across from you will honour their word, that ships will arrive when promised, that quality will match claims. In a world without enforceable contracts or reliable law, perfume traders operate on reputation and ritual, and a shared cup of wine matters more than any written agreement. As you walk back through the waking city, you think about the invisible threads connecting this morning's transaction to countless others. The harvester in Punt who bled the tree 6 months ago, the ship captain who navigated by stars, the temple priestess who'll burn this frankincense tonight in prayers to Hathor, the noblewoman who'll wear perfume made from it, the lover who'll catch that scent and feel something stir. All of this, just so the world can smell a little more divine. You're back in the workshop, but today the space feels different, more crowded, more purposeful, humming with the kind of focused energy that comes when skilled people are doing work they actually care about. 3 other perfumers have joined you and Myriette, each stationed at their own work table, each responsible for a different stage of production. This is how the real work happens. Not one priestess toiling alone, but a coordinated effort that resembles a well-run kitchen, more than the mystical laboratory you might imagine. One woman is macerating flower petals in oil, pressing them gently with a wooden paddle to release their essence without crushing them into pulp. Another is tending a small fire where a copper pot sits at a careful angle, reducing some mixture until it reaches the right consistency. The third is doing what you'll be doing shortly, grinding resins into powder fine enough to pass through linen mesh. The workshop itself would fascinate any modern chemist, even if the ancient perfumers wouldn't recognize half the terminology you'd use to describe their work. Stone mortars and pestles of varying sizes line the walls, each worn smooth by generations of use. Alabaster jars with sealed lids crowd the shelves. Alabaster because it stays cool even in summer heat and doesn't react with oils the way some materials do. Bronze and copper tools hang from hooks, their surfaces darkened with age and use. In the corner, several large ceramic amphoras contain different carrier oils. Moringa oil, which the Egyptians call ben oil, prized because it doesn't go rancid as quickly as others. Castor oil, thick and stable. And your personal favourite Balanos oil from the desert date, which has a subtle sweetness that enhances rather than competes with other fragrances. Here's what the archaeological record shows. Egyptian perfumers were essentially doing cold enfleurage and hot maceration, techniques that wouldn't be formally named or systematized until French perfumers codified them thousands of years later. They understood that different flowers release their scent best in different conditions. Lotus and lily needed gentle cold extraction, petals pressed into fat or oil over days, the fat absorbing the fragrance molecule by molecule. Rose and jasmine responded better to heat, their scent unlocking when gently warmed in oil, but destroyed if the temperature climbed too high. The perfumers didn't know about chemical compounds or molecular structures, but they knew what worked, and they'd refined their techniques across centuries until the knowledge became instinctive. Myriette assigns you to work with frankincense today, which means grinding. You select a mortar, medium-sized, smooth basalt, cool to the touch, and begin breaking down the resin chunks into progressively smaller pieces. The work is meditative, almost hypnotic. Your arm moves in steady circles, the pestle finds its rhythm, and your mind drifts while your hands continue their skilled labour. This is the part of perfume making that nobody celebrates, the tedious foundation that makes beauty possible. Before anything can smell divine, someone has to grind it into powder fine enough to mix smoothly, and that someone is usually the youngest person in the workshop. The woman macerating flowers, her name is Neferet, and she's been doing this longer than you've been alive, starts singing softly, one of the old working songs that helps maintain rhythm. The others join in, and suddenly the workshop feels less like a place of business, and more like a gathering of friends, which in some ways it is. Perfumers form a kind of guild, though not formally recognised. You share techniques, gossip and complaints about suppliers. You attend each other's family celebrations and mourn each other's losses. This scent of the workshop gets into your clothes and hair and skin, marking you as one of this particular tribe. Here's your quirky detail. Some of the tools you're using are older than the current dynasty. That pestle in your hand. It was already ancient when Hatshepsut sent her ships to Punt. The larger amphoras storing carrier oils bear marks from multiple temples, passed around or sold as institutions rose and fell. There's something profound about working with tools that have been used for centuries, knowing that your hands are making the same motions that countless other hands have made, solving the same problems, creating beauty from raw materials in ways that haven't fundamentally changed despite political upheavals and changing pharaohs. The perfume persists. Mariette walks between the tables, checking everyone's progress, offering corrections or encouragement as needed. When she reaches you, she picks up a pinch of your ground frankincense and rubs it between her fingers, testing the texture. "Finer," she says, not unkindly. "You're rushing. Take your time. Perfume can't be hurried." You nod and adjust your technique, leaning into the grind with more patience, breaking down the stubborn particles that resist easy crushing. The process of making perfume is slower than most people imagine. That jar of lotus oil that a noblewoman might buy in the market. It started weeks earlier with someone harvesting lotus flowers at dawn, when their scent is strongest. The petals were layered between fat spread on glass or stone, left in a cool room, replaced daily with fresh flowers until the fat became saturated with fragrance. Then the fat was gently warmed and strained through linen to remove plant matter, mixed with oil to create a workable consistency, and finally poured into containers that were sealed with beeswax and labelled with the date and flower source. The finished product represents dozens of hours of labour and hundreds of individual lotus flowers, all to create a few ounces of scented oil. Historians still argue about whether Egyptian perfumers discovered distillation. Some evidence suggests they did, at least in rudimentary form. Certain tomb paintings show what might be primitive alembics, and clay vessels with unusual shapes have been found that could theoretically have been used for condensing vapours. But if they did distill, they didn't do it on any commercial scale. Most Egyptian perfume was oil-based, relying on the principle that oils absorb and hold scent molecules effectively. The alcohol-based perfumes that would later dominate European markets were still centuries away, requiring distillation techniques that wouldn't become widespread until Islamic scholars refined them. Nefret finishes her batch of flower oil and comes to check on your progress. She's a tiny woman, barely reaching your shoulder, but her arms are surprisingly strong from years of grinding and stirring. "You know what Mariette won't tell you?" she says quietly, glancing to make sure the older woman is out of earshot. "The secret to good perfume isn't ingredients or technique, it's intention. You have to pour yourself into it. Imagine who's going to wear it, what moment it might enhance. A perfume made by someone who's just going through the motions, it smells fine, but it's dead. A perfume made by someone who cares, that one changes things. You're not sure if you believe this. It sounds dangerously close to superstition, the kind of thinking that attributes magical properties to mundane actions. But then again, you've tasted bread baked by someone happy versus someone miserable, and there's usually a difference even when the recipe is identical. Maybe intention does matter. Maybe emotion leaves traces we can't quite name but can definitely sense. Or maybe Neferet is just a romantic who likes to believe her work matters more than it does. Either way, you start grinding with more attention, thinking about prayers carried on perfumed smoke, about women preparing for lovers, about the dead being anointed for their journey. By the time you finish, your forearm aches and your frankincense is powder fine as flour, pale gold and aromatic. Mariette approves with a nod and sets you to the next task. mixing the powder with warmed myrrh oil to create an incense paste. The proportions matter intensely. Too much oil and the mixture won't hold its shape. Too little and it'll be dry and crumbly and won't burn properly. You work by feel as much as measurement, adding oil in careful drizzles until the paste reaches the consistency of wet sand, holding together when squeezed but not sticky. As afternoon light slants through the high windows, turning dust motes into golden constellations, you realize you've been in this workshop for hours and it feels like minutes. Time moves strangely when your hands are busy and your mind is quiet, when the work itself becomes a kind of meditation. By the time you leave, you'll smell like frankincense and myrrh for days, the scent so deeply embedded in your skin that even vigorous washing won't completely remove it. You've become the perfume you make, marked by your labour in ways both visible and invisible. You're standing in a courtyard garden that shouldn't exist, not here in the desert where the sun bakes everything into submission and water is more precious than almost any perfume ingredient. But wealth buys miracles, and the woman who owns this villa has wealth enough to convince water to flow uphill through clay pipes, to persuade roses to bloom in Memphis, to create a pocket of impossible green in the middle of brown and beige. You're here because this woman, Lady Isetemkeb, though everyone calls her simply Iset, has commissioned a custom perfume, something unique that will be hers alone, and Mariette has sent you to gather fresh flowers from her private garden, because Iset insists on knowing exactly where every ingredient comes from. The garden stretches before you, terraced and carefully planned, each level devoted to different plants. You see henna bushes with their delicate white flowers, their scent light and honey sweet. Madonna lilies, tall and stately, their blooms so white they almost hurt to look at in the bright sun. Blue lotus in a man-made pond, their flowers opening to the morning light, sacred to the gods and beloved by perfumers for their complex, slightly narcotic fragrance. And roses, by the gods, so many roses, cultivated in beds that must require constant attention, each bush heavy with blooms ranging from pale pink to deep crimson. Here's something that might surprise you. Roses aren't native to Egypt. They came from Persia and Syria, imported by traders who recognized their value, and by pharaohs who wanted gardens that impressed foreign dignitaries. The Egyptians fell in love with roses the way people often do, completely and illogically, willing to spend resources they couldn't really spare to cultivate beauty that would fade within days. But oh, the scent. If frankincense is the smell of heaven, rose is the smell of earth at its very best, rich and complex, and somehow both innocent and seductive at once. You've brought baskets and linen cloths, and you move through the garden with practiced efficiency, selecting flowers that are just past their first bloom, not so fresh they're still tight and scentless, not so old they're beginning to brown and fade. The gardener, an older man whose name you didn't catch, follows you at a respectful distance, occasionally pointing out particularly fine specimens or warning you away from plants that aren't ready for harvest. He clearly takes pride in this space, and you respect that. A good garden is as much art as a good perfume. Maybe more so because gardens are alive, constantly changing, requiring daily attention and deep knowledge. Do you know what she wants this perfume for? The gardener asks, conversational in the way of people who spend most of their days alone with plants and welcome any human interaction. A seduction, you say, because Mariette told you that much. She's trying to reclaim her husband's attention. He's taken a younger mistress, and Iset wants to remind him what he's risking. The gardener makes a non-committal sound. Roses and jasmine, then. Maybe some cardamom for spice. Men are simple creatures. easier to manipulate than plants if you know what you're doing. You laugh at that, appreciating his directness. There's something refreshing about people who work with their hands, who deal with practical realities rather than social niceties. But his suggestion is solid. Rose for romantic love, jasmine for sensuality, cardamom for the unexpected element that makes a scent memorable rather than merely pleasant. You make a mental note to recommend exactly that combination to Mariette, though she's probably already planned it. Here's the historical reality that often gets romanticized. Cleopatra VII, the famous one, the last pharaoh of Egypt before Rome swallowed the kingdom whole, was legendary for her use of perfume as a tool of statecraft and seduction. The most famous story claims that when she travelled to meet Mark Antony for the first time, she had the sails of her ship soaked in perfume so that their scent announced her arrival before the ship was even visible. Another account describes her bedroom floors covered ankle-deep in rose petals, the sheer extravagance of it making a statement about power and sensuality that words couldn't match. Are these stories true? Historians still argue about it. Some claim they're exaggerations or inventions by Roman writers who wanted to portray Cleopatra as an exotic, dangerous foreign temptress. Others point to the detailed records of perfume purchases by the Ptolemaic court, and suggest that if anyone had the resources and inclination to pull off such elaborate fragrant theatre, it would be Cleopatra. The truth probably lives somewhere in the middle. Yes, she used perfume strategically, but maybe not quite as dramatically as the legends suggest. Still, the legends persist because they feel true. They match our understanding of how power and seduction work, how scent can be deployed as weapon and invitation simultaneously. You fill your baskets with roses, their petals soft against your fingers, thorns occasionally catching on your linen dress. The scent intensifies as you work, released by the small damage your harvesting causes. By the time you're finished, you're practically drunk on rose, your head light, and your thoughts pleasantly scattered. This is another thing perfume workers rarely discuss. The occupational hazard of constantly being slightly intoxicated by your materials. You develop a tolerance over time, but certain flowers, especially in concentration, still affect you. Rose makes you dreamy. Jasmine makes you alert and slightly anxious. Lotus makes you philosophical, prone to long thoughts about mortality and desire. The quirky detail that gets lost in most discussions of Cleopatra's perfume use. She probably didn't smell the way we imagine. Our modern idea of Egyptian perfume is based on French interpretations filtered through Victorian sensibilities, all clean and refined and bottled in crystal. The actual ancient versions were heavier, oilier, more animal. They included ingredients we'd find off-putting today. Civet musk, ambergris, sometimes small amounts of blood or urine from specific animals, all used to create depth and longevity. Cleopatra's signature scent, whatever it was, probably announced itself from several feet away and lingered in rooms long after she'd left. Subtle was not the goal. Memorable was. You move on to harvest jasmine next, climbing a trellis where the vines grow thick and twisted, their small white flowers almost hidden among the leaves. Jasmine is tricky. Its scent is strongest at night, and many perfumers prefer to harvest just after sunset. But these flowers are acceptable, especially since they'll be used fresh rather than dried. You select the most open blooms, those that have already begun their nightly perfuming of the air, and add them carefully to a separate basket. Jasmine bruises easily, and bruised jasmine smells wrong, greenish and bitter rather than sweet and seductive. The garden owner, Isette, emerges from the house as you're finishing. She's perhaps 40, still beautiful in the way of women who've had the resources to take care of themselves. good food, shade from the worst sun, oils rubbed into skin daily to prevent drying and wrinkling. She wears a sheath dress so fine you can almost see through it, and her wig is elaborately styled with gold thread woven through the braids. But what strikes you most is her expression. Determined, slightly desperate. The look of someone fighting a battle they're not sure they can win. "Will it work?" she asks without preamble, gesturing at your baskets of flowers. "Will Perfume bring him back?" You consider lying, offering false reassurance, but something in her face makes you respect her enough to be honest. "Perfume can remind him," you say carefully. "It can create a mood, open a door, but you'll still have to walk through it yourself. Fragrance is a tool, not a solution." She studies you for a long moment, then nods. "That's wiser than I expected from someone so young. Marriott trained you well." She reaches into a purse hanging from her belt and pulls out a small piece of gold. "Payment, though you weren't expecting it. The temple will be compensated separately." "For your honesty," she says, "and for your discretion. I'd prefer my husband not know I'm this desperate." You accept the gold, tuck it away, and gather your baskets. As you leave, you glance back once to see Iset standing among her impossible roses, a woman using every weapon available to fight the cruelty of time and male attention, and you think about how Perfume has always been this. Hope pressed into oil, beauty extracted from flowers, the desperate belief that the right scent might change everything. You're preparing for a banquet tonight. Though you won't be a guest, you'll be working, moving through the crowds with a tray of perfumed cones, offering them to noble women who've arrived without their own. It's a curious Egyptian custom, one that always makes foreigners do a double take when they first witness it. Cone-shaped lumps of perfumed fat placed atop elaborate wigs, where they slowly melt throughout the evening, releasing fragrance and creating glistening trails of scented oil down the wearer's hair, neck, and shoulders. It looks bizarre if you're not used to it, but the effect is genuinely lovely. A constantly renewing cloud of fragrance that intensifies as the night warms and the fat softens, mixing with body heat to create something personal and evolving. The cones themselves take days to prepare properly. You start with rendered animal fat, usually beef tallow or mutton fat, carefully purified to remove any meat smell that might compete with the perfume. The fat is melted and mixed with ground myrrh, cinnamon, cardamom, and whatever other aromatics the client requests. Then the mixture is poured into cone-shaped moulds and left to solidify in a cool room. The result looks unimpressive. Waxy, slightly grey-white pyramids about the size of your fist. But when activated by body heat, they transform into fragrance delivery systems more effective than anything you could achieve with simple oil application. Here's what the tomb paintings show us. Egyptian banquets were elaborate, multi-sensory affairs where food, music, dance, and perfume combined to create an atmosphere of abundance and pleasure. The walls of nobles' tombs are covered with banquet scenes. Guests seated on chairs or cushions, musicians playing harps and drums, dancers performing acrobatic movements, servants circulating with wine and food, and yes, women wearing those distinctive perfume cones atop their wigs. Some art historians initially thought the cones were symbolic rather than literal, perhaps representing divine blessing or purification. But chemical analysis of residue in serving vessels and fragments of fabric from mummy wrappings confirms it. They really did wear melting fat on their heads, and it really was perfumed. You're making cones for tonight's banquet now, working at a table in the temple workshop that's been designated for commercial orders. The temple perfumers do this work to fund the sacred operations. the kephi for rituals, the oils for anointing priests, the incense for daily prayers. The wealthy pay premium prices for perfume cones made by temple artisans, knowing the quality will be superior to what they'd get from market vendors who cut corners and substitute inferior ingredients. Your hands work automatically at this point. Measure in fat, mixing in ground aromatics, testing consistency, pouring into moulds. You've made hundreds of these, maybe thousands. Mariette walks by and pauses to check your work. She picks up one of your finished cones, brings it to her nose, inhales deeply. Good, she says, which from her is high praise, though you could add a touch more myrrh. Rich people like to smell expensive, and myrrh announces wealth better than almost anything. You add another pinch of myrrh powder to your next batch, stirring it into the melted fat until it's evenly distributed. The scent is strong enough to make your eyes water slightly. Myrrh in concentration has that effect, something sharp and resinous that cuts through other smells. But Mariette is right. When someone wears this, other guests will catch the scent and immediately recognize it as costly. Perfume has always been about signalling status as much as smelling pleasant. Here's the quirky detail that often gets overlooked. The melting cones had a practical purpose beyond just fragrance and status display. Egypt is hot. Banquets often lasted hours, sometimes stretching from sunset until dawn. The perfumed fat coating hair and skin provided a kind of moisturizing treatment, preventing the dry air from completely desiccating exposed skin. It also helped repel insects. Many of the aromatics used in perfume, including myrrh and cinnamon, have natural insect repellent properties. So while it looked extravagant and certainly was expensive, the practice also made parties more comfortable, which is probably why it persisted across centuries. That evening, you arrive at the host's villa carrying a tray of perfume cones nested in soft fabric to prevent chipping. The house is already filling with guests, their voices creating a low murmur of conversation punctuated by laughter. Servants move through rooms lighting oil lamps, and musicians tune their instruments in the corner. You recognize some of the guests: minor nobility, wealthy merchants, a priest from the Temple of Amun wearing his leopard skin cloak. The air already smells of wine, roasted meat, baking bread, and underneath it all, the distinct musk of too many perfumed bodies in one space. A woman approaches you almost immediately, young, pretty, her wig slightly askew as though she dressed in a hurry. "Do you have lotus?" she asks. "I forgot mine entirely, and my husband will be furious if I'm the only woman here without proper perfume." There's something desperate in her voice that makes you sympathetic. You select a cone scented primarily with lotus and hand it to her, showing her how to position it atop her wig so it won't slide off as it melts. She pays you, overpays actually, her relief worth more than the perfume, and hurries away to join her husband, who's deep in conversation with a cluster of other men. You watch her for a moment, see her husband glance over, notice the perfume cone, and nod with what might be approval, or might just be acknowledgement. Small victories in the complicated dance of marriage and social expectations. Historians still argue about whether the perfume cone custom was practiced by all classes, or only the wealthy. The archaeological evidence is limited. Fat doesn't preserve well, and most of what we know comes from tomb paintings of elite banquets. But logic suggests that if the rich wore perfume cones, the middle classes probably imitated them with cheaper versions, perhaps using less expensive fats and simpler aromatics. Maybe they only wore them for special occasions, weddings, religious festivals, significant birthdays, while the truly wealthy wore them casually, the same way modern rich people wear designer clothes to breakfast. You circulate through the party, offering cones to women who need them, accepting payment, answering questions about ingredients and longevity. One older woman, her face painted with elaborate cosmetics, asks if you have anything that will mask the smell of beer on breath. You don't, not really, but you suggest a cone heavy in mint which might help. She laughs and buys two, one for herself and one for her sister, who she says drinks even more enthusiastically. As the night progresses and the cones begin to melt, the party transforms into a cloud of competing and complementing fragrances. You can track guests by scent. The woman wearing lotus moves past and you smell it before you see her. The man wearing cedarwood oil in his beard announces himself from across the room. It's overwhelming at first, but then your nose adjusts, learns to pick out individual notes from the olfactory chaos. This is what Egyptian parties smelled like, you think. Wine and sweat and perfumed fat and lamp smoke and food and flowers, all combining into something uniquely human and strangely beautiful. Late in the evening, you notice Isette, the woman whose garden you visited. She's wearing a perfume cone, probably one you made since Marriott completed her custom order yesterday, and she's standing close to a man who must be her husband, speaking softly into his ear while her hand rests lightly on his arm. The perfume has worked its magic, or she has, or more likely both together. He's paying attention, at least. His body turned toward her rather than scanning the room for younger distractions. You'll never know if the perfume sealed the deal or just created the opening she needed. But you smile anyway, pleased to have played a small part in her campaign. You're standing in a room that smells like death trying to become eternal, and it's both disturbing and strangely beautiful in the way that Egyptian religion always is. Never flinching from mortality, always insisting that something continues beyond the moment when breathing stops. The embalming workshop sits on the west bank of the Nile, where the sun sets and the dead are buried, where the boundary between this world and the next feels thinner somehow. You're here because Marriott has arranged for you to learn about mummification perfumes, the specialized oils and resins that preserve bodies for their journey through the underworld. It's not glamorous work, but it's essential, and the perfumers who specialize in funerary preparations are among the most respected in the profession. The chief embalmer, a man named Amenhotep, whose hands are permanently stained dark from decades of handling natron and resins, greets you without much warmth, but without hostility either. He's simply practical, a craftsman who understands that death is a business, and someone has to handle it professionally. The body on the table before him is in the early stages of preservation. Internal organs already removed and stored in canopic jars, the corpse packed in natron salt to draw out moisture. It'll stay like this for 40 days, the same length of time it takes to make proper kifai, which probably isn't a coincidence. The Egyptians loved their symbolic numbers. You understand what we do here? Amenhotep asks, not looking up from his work. He's applying a mixture of cedar oil to the body's skin, his movements practiced and efficient. We're not just preserving flesh. We're creating a vessel for the car to return to, a home for the soul between judgments. The perfumes matter because the gods notice how the dead smell. A properly anointed body receives better treatment in the afterlife. You don't know if you believe that literally, but you nod anyway. Whether or not the gods care about perfume, the living certainly do. Funeral rituals are as much for the survivors as for the deceased, providing comfort through familiar scents and expensive displays that prove the dead were loved and valued. A cheaply prepared mummy suggests the family didn't care enough to invest in a proper afterlife, which must haunt the survivors as much as it supposedly disadvantages the dead. Here's what the historical record tells us. Mummification was big business in ancient Egypt, with prices varying wildly based on quality. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, described 3 tiers of service. The premium option included extensive use of myrrh and other expensive perfumes, careful removal and preservation of organs, and elaborate wrapping with dozens of layers of linen soaked in resin. The budget option involved injecting cedar oil into the body cavity and hoping for the best. Most people fell somewhere in the middle, purchasing what their families could afford, knowing that even basic mummification with cheap perfumes was better than nothing. Amenhotep shows you the oils and resins used in his work. There's cedar oil from Lebanon, thick and almost tar-like, valued for its preservative properties as much as its scent. Frankincense and myrrh resins, ground and mixed with fat to create an anointing paste. Palm wine infused with cinnamon and cassia, used to rinse body cavities. Bitumen from the Dead Sea, black and sticky, giving mummies their characteristic dark colour. The word mummy itself derives from the Persian word for bitumen, and underneath everything, the sharp mineral smell of natron, the desiccating salt that does most of the actual preservation work. The perfumes serve multiple purposes, Amenhotep explains, warming to his subject now that he's talking about technical details. Obviously they mask decomposition odours during the early stages, but they also inhibit bacterial growth. Myrrh especially has antimicrobial properties, though we didn't have that terminology. We just knew it worked. And the resins create a protective coating that seals the skin, prevents moisture from re-entering the tissues. Here's the quirky detail. Some of the mummification perfumes were believed to have magical properties specific to the afterlife journey. Frankincense was thought to purify the soul, making it more acceptable to Osiris during the weighing of the heart ceremony. Myrrh represented bitter suffering transformed into something precious, appropriate for a body undergoing the transformation from mortal to eternal. Cedar oil was associated with durability and strength, qualities the soul would need during its dangerous passage through the underworld. Whether these associations had any objective reality, or were simply comforting stories people told themselves, they influenced which perfumes were used and how they were applied. You watch Amenhotep work, his hands moving with the confidence of long practice. He applies perfumed resin to the body's chest, massaging it into the skin with circular motions. Despite the clinical nature of the work, there's something almost tender about his approach, a care that suggests he takes his responsibility seriously. This person, you don't know who they were, some merchant or official's wife based on the quality of preparation being provided, trusted their family to deliver them properly into the next world, and Amenhotep is honouring that trust with skilled hands and expensive perfumes. The worst part isn't the smell, he says suddenly, as if reading your thoughts. You get used to that faster than you'd think. The worst part is knowing that everything we do here might be meaningless. Maybe there is no afterlife, no judgment, no reunion with loved ones. Maybe it's all just rot and darkness and nothing. But we do the work anyway, because what else is there? Hope dressed up in perfume and prayers. It's the most philosophical statement you've heard from him, and it catches you off guard. Before you can respond, he moves on to the next stage of preparation, mixing a fresh batch of resin with ground myrrh. The scent fills the room, familiar and sacred. The same myrrh you use in temple incense and luxury perfumes, now deployed in service of the dead. Historians still argue about whether Egyptian embalmers actually believed in the elaborate afterlife mythology, or if they were simply providing a service they knew people wanted. The cynical interpretation suggests they were businessmen exploiting grief and religious belief for profit. The charitable interpretation sees them as priests of a sort, performing sacred work that maintained cosmic order by ensuring the proper transition of souls from mortal to eternal existence. Probably the truth contains elements of both, because humans are complicated and can believe in something while also profiting from it, can perform sacred work with sincerity while accepting payment. Amenhotep lets you help with the next stage, preparing the linen wrappings that will eventually cocoon the body. The linen strips are soaked in a mixture of resin, myrrh oil and frankincense, then carefully wrung out and hung to dry slightly. They should be saturated but not dripping, flexible but not wet. When wrapped around the body in dozens of overlapping layers, they'll create an aromatic armour that preserves what's inside while announcing to anyone who opens the tomb centuries later, someone loved this person enough to send them into eternity smelling divine. You know what's strange? Amenhotep says as you work together in companionable silence. The living spend fortunes on perfume to attract lovers, to impress rivals, to feel beautiful for a few hours. But the dead wear the most expensive perfumes of all. Perfumes that will last for thousands of years, and they'll never smell them. The perfume is entirely for others, for the gods, for the embalmers, for whoever eventually disturbs the tomb. It's the most generous use of fragrance imaginable. Pure gift, no personal benefit. You think about this as you leave the embalming house, stepping back into the sunlight and air that smells like dust and river water and living things. The perfumes you make serve life, attraction, pleasure, prayer, comfort. But the perfumes Amenhotep uses serve something larger, the great transition that awaits everyone, the moment when breath stops and questions about what comes next cease being theoretical. Maybe that's why mummification perfumes are so precious, so carefully specified in ritual texts and tomb inscriptions. They're humanity's answer to mortality. If we can't prevent death, at least we can make it smell like something sacred. You're in the temple archive room when Marriott tells you the story that sends a chill down your spine despite the afternoon heat. She's showing you an old papyrus scroll brittle with age, containing perfume formulas passed down through generations of temple perfumers. Her finger traces one particular recipe, and she speaks quietly, as if the walls might be listening. "This one," she says, "is forbidden now, has been for 3 dynasties. But it used to be the signature scent of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, and when he died, the recipe was declared royal property. Anyone caught making it after his death was executed. 2 perfumers lost their heads for refusing to forget it." The concept of forbidden perfumes feels strange at first. How can you ban a smell? Control who's allowed to wear certain combinations of frankincense and myrrh? But the more you learn, the more you understand that in Egypt, where religion and politics intertwine like lovers in bed, everything can be regulated, and scent is no exception. Certain perfumes are restricted by law, by religious decree, or by customs so powerful they might as well be law. To wear the wrong perfume at the wrong time can be not just a social mistake but a criminal act, possibly even a death sentence. Here's what the historical evidence shows. Egyptian society had elaborate rules about perfume use during different periods and occasions. During mourning periods, perfume was generally forbidden except for specific funerary oils used in embalming. To wear recreational perfume while in official mourning was considered deeply disrespectful to the dead, suggesting you cared more about your own pleasure than honouring the deceased. Temple records occasionally mention fines levied against people who violated these mourning restrictions, proving that someone was actually enforcing these rules rather than just suggesting them. More significantly, certain perfume formulas were reserved exclusively for royalty. The pharaoh wasn't just a political leader, but a living god, and his divine status needed to be marked in every possible way, including scent. Royal perfume recipes were guarded secrets, known only to a small number of trusted perfumers who served the palace directly. These perfumers worked in isolation, their workshops separate from regular temple facilities, and they swore oaths of secrecy backed by threats of execution for betrayal. When a pharaoh died, his signature scent often died with him, the recipe deliberately destroyed or locked away to ensure no one could impersonate the divine smell. Why would someone risk death to make a forbidden perfume, you ask Mariette, genuinely confused. The punishment seems wildly disproportionate to the crime of mixing some oils together. She looks at you with something between pity and amusement. You're young yet. You don't understand how badly people want what they can't have. Forbidden perfumes aren't just about smell. They're about power, about claiming status you weren't born into. If you could wear the pharaoh's personal scent, you're symbolically elevating yourself to his level, even if only in your own mind. That's why it's forbidden. That's why the punishment is so severe. It's not about perfume. It's about maintaining the cosmic order. Here's a quirky detail that rarely makes it into history texts. Some perfumes were forbidden not for political reasons but for religious ones, specifically tied to ritual purity. During certain temple ceremonies, perfumes containing specific animal musks were prohibited because they were considered too earthly, too connected to physical sexuality and mortality. Priests performing rituals to sun gods or creation deities needed to smell only of plants and resins, frankincense, myrrh, lotus, nothing that came from animal bodies. Breaking this rule didn't necessarily get you executed, but it did invalidate the ritual, potentially angering the gods and bringing bad fortune on the entire community. Mariette tells you about the mourning restrictions in more detail. When someone dies, their immediate family enters a formal mourning period lasting 70 days, the same length of time required for proper mummification. During this period, mourners are expected to present themselves as visibly grief-stricken. Unwashed hair, torn clothing, no cosmetics, and absolutely no recreational perfume. Only the strictly necessary, perhaps a bit of oil to prevent skin from cracking in the dry air, but nothing that suggests pleasure or vanity. The wealthy find this particularly difficult. They're accustomed to perfuming themselves multiple times daily, to never appearing in public without their signature scent. 70 days without perfume must feel like 70 days naked. I've seen people try to cheat, Mariette says, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. They'll apply just a tiny amount of scented oil, thinking no one will notice. But we always do. Perfume workers recognize scents the way painters recognize colors. You can't hide it from us. Usually we say nothing. Grief makes people do strange things, and small violations can be forgiven. But if someone shows up to the funeral itself wearing obvious perfume, that's when scandal erupts. Historians still argue about whether these perfume restrictions were consistently enforced, or if they were more like guidelines that people followed when convenient. The archaeological record shows that some tombs contained perfume jars alongside the burial goods, which seems to contradict the idea that mourning required perfume abstinence. But perhaps those jars were meant for the deceased's use in the afterlife rather than for the mourners. Or perhaps the rules varied by region and dynasty, strict in some periods and places, relaxed in others. Ancient Egypt spanned 3,000 years, longer than the entire history from the fall of Rome to today. so assuming consistent practices across that time span is probably naive. You ask Marriott if she's ever been tempted to recreate one of the forbidden royal perfumes, just to know what it smelled like. She gives you a sharp look. Every perfumer is tempted, she admits. We have the recipes, at least some of them. We have the skills. We could do it easily. But some knowledge is dangerous not because of what it is, but because of what happens if you use it. A forbidden perfume made in secret, worn in private. Who would know? But if even one other person catches the scent and recognizes it, if they report you, if the palace guards come asking questions, your head ends up decorating a pike, and your family loses everything. Is satisfying curiosity worth that risk? She pulls out another scroll, this one more recent, and shows you a list of perfumes restricted during specific festivals. During the Opet festival, when the statue of Amun travels from Karnak to Luxor, certain scents are prohibited in the processional path because they might offend the god. During the beautiful festival of the valley, when the living visit tombs to feast with the dead, strong perfumes are discouraged because they might mask the scent of offerings. The dead supposedly enjoy the aroma of food and drink, and overpowering personal perfumes are considered rude, like talking loudly during someone else's conversation. The rules aren't arbitrary, Marriott explains, seeing your skeptical expression. Each restriction has a reason, even if the reason is sometimes just because that's how we've always done it. Traditions accumulate meaning over time. What starts as one pharaoh's preference becomes sacred custom, becomes punishable law, and perfume, because it's invisible but undeniable, because it affects everyone nearby whether they consent or not, becomes a perfect vehicle for these social controls. You think about modern uses of perfume, how even in your time there are unspoken rules about scent. Don't wear heavy perfume to temple. It competes with the incense. Don't perfume yourself before visiting the sick. Strong smells can trigger nausea. Don't wear seductive scents to funerals or overtly expensive perfumes to visit poor relatives. The rules may not be enforced by execution, but they're real nonetheless, written in social consequences rather than legal codes. Before you leave the archive room, Marriott makes you promise something. If you ever discover a forbidden formula, she says seriously, tell me immediately. Don't try to make it, don't even write it down. Some knowledge should stay lost. The perfumes of dead pharaohs belong to the dead. Let them keep their secrets. You promise, though privately you wonder if you'd keep that promise if you actually found something extraordinary. The temptation to create something forbidden, to smell what gods once smelled, must be enormous. But you also remember the story of the two perfumers who lost their heads, and you think maybe some curiosities are best left unsatisfied, some fragrances better imagined than experienced. You're walking through what can only be described as an earthly paradise, though calling it a garden feels inadequate for the scale and ambition of what you're witnessing. This is the temple garden of Karnak, acres of cultivated beauty devoted entirely to producing flowers, herbs, and plants for perfume production. The air itself feels thick with competing fragrances, not unpleasant but overwhelming in its complexity, like trying to listen to 50 conversations simultaneously. Everywhere you look, something is blooming. Blue lotus dominates the central pond, their flowers opening to the morning sun like worshippers raising their faces to Ra. Henna bushes line the pathways, their small white flowers releasing honey-sweet scent. Madonna lilies stand in regimented rows, tall and impossibly white, their perfume so intense it makes your head swim slightly. The head gardener, a woman named Takat who spent 40 years coaxing beauty from desert soil, walks beside you, explaining the intricacies of perfume cultivation with the passionate detail of someone discussing their children. Lotus is temperamental, she says, gesturing at the pond. The blue lotus especially. It needs specific water depth, specific mud composition, and you cannot transplant it successfully. It dies if you try to move it. So we built the pond exactly where the lotus wanted to grow, not where we wanted the pond to be. Sometimes you must negotiate with plants. Here's what the archaeological evidence tells us. Egyptian temples maintained extensive gardens specifically for perfume production. And these weren't decorative afterthoughts, but essential economic operations. Analysis of pollen samples from temple sites shows deliberate cultivation of perfume plants in concentrations that wouldn't occur naturally. Hieroglyphic texts describe garden layouts, irrigation systems, and seasonal planting schedules with the precision of modern agricultural manuals. The Temple of Karnak alone maintained gardens covering several acres, employing dozens of gardeners year-round, producing flowers worth more than gold when properly processed into perfume. Takat stops beside a rose bed and kneels, running her fingers through the soil. Roses came from Syria originally, she says, and they hate our climate. Too hot, too dry, wrong soil, but we've learned tricks over generations. We plant them in partial shade, mix sand into clay soil to improve drainage, water them twice daily during summer. Even then, they're difficult. A bad sandstorm or unusual cold snap can kill an entire bed overnight. But when they succeed... She cups a pink bloom in her palm, bringing it to her nose with reverent care. When they succeed, there's no scent on earth more beautiful. You wonder about the economics of maintaining gardens like this. The water alone must cost a fortune. Canals dug from the Nile, clay pipes carrying water uphill through gravity-defying engineering, daily irrigation during the dry season. The labour represents dozens of workers who could be employed in other productive activities. The land itself is valuable, especially this close to the temple complex. Yet the priests consider it essential, not optional. Why? Because perfume is how they communicate with gods, how they attract wealthy donors, how they maintain prestige and political influence. The garden isn't a luxury, it's infrastructure. Here's the quirky detail. Some perfume plants were considered so sacred that harvesting them required ritual purification and prayer. Blue lotus especially. Before cutting lotus flowers, harvesters would wash in the temple pond, recite prayers to Nefertum, the god of perfume and lotus flowers, and make small offerings of bread and beer. The flowers weren't just agricultural products, but divine gifts that needed to be received with appropriate reverence. Whether this actually made the perfume better, or if it was purely ceremonial, you can't say. But Takat insists that flowers harvested with proper respect always smell sweeter than those gathered carelessly. And who are you to argue with 40 years of experience? Takat shows you the henna bushes next, their branches heavy with clusters of tiny white flowers that smell like orange blossoms mixed with honey. Henna is easier than roses, she says with obvious relief. It likes heat, tolerates drought, grows reliably year after year. The flowers produce excellent perfume, and the leaves we use for dyeing hair and skin, nothing is wasted. It's the perfect temple plant, really. Beautiful, useful, and low maintenance. You've used henna yourself, of course. Most Egyptian women do, grinding the leaves into paste for decorating hands and feet with intricate temporary tattoos, or mixing it into oil to dye hair a rich reddish brown. But you'd never considered it a perfume plant until Mariette started teaching you about extraction techniques. The flowers release their scent best when macerated in warm oil, slowly, over several days. The resulting perfume is delicate and cheerful, perfect for young women or morning rituals, lacking the heavy seductiveness of rose or jasmine, but possessing its own gentle charm. Historians still argue about whether Egyptian perfume gardens were purely functional, or if they also served aesthetic and recreational purposes. Did priests and priestesses walk these paths for pleasure, or only for work? The tomb paintings show wealthy Egyptians relaxing in gardens, but those are private estates, not temple grounds. Still, you can imagine that maintaining beauty day after day must generate some appreciation for it. Takat clearly loves these plants, knows them individually, mourns when they die, and celebrates when they thrive. You can't spend 40 years growing flowers without developing emotional attachment, even if your official purpose is commercial production. She leads you to a section of the garden you haven't seen before, separated from the main areas by a low wall. "This is where we experiment," she says, and you hear pride in her voice. New plants from traders, crossbreeding attempts, unusual growing techniques. Most experiments fail, but the successes make it worthwhile. Last year, we successfully established a bed of Indian tuberose. No one thought it could survive here, but look. She gestures at waxy white flowers growing improbably in Egyptian soil. The scent is extraordinary, too heavy for most applications, but mixed carefully with lotus or rose, it adds depth we couldn't achieve with native plants alone. You bend to smell the tuberose and understand immediately what she means. The fragrance is almost aggressively sweet, narcotic in its intensity, with a creamy richness that coats the inside of your nose. It's too much by itself, overwhelming, but you can imagine it in careful proportion with other scents, adding complexity and longevity. This is how perfumery advances, you realize, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through patient experimentation, gradual accumulation of knowledge about what works and what doesn't. The Madonna lilies occupy their own section, given pride of place near the temple proper. These are the most sacred flowers in the garden, associated with fertility, rebirth, and divine purity. Their perfume is used in rituals honoring Isis and Hathor, in oils for anointing priests, in incense for the most important ceremonies. Takat explains that Madonna lily cultivation is practically an art form unto itself. The bulbs must be planted at specific depths, the flowers harvested only in early morning when their scent is strongest, but before the sun has stressed the petals. Even the timing of watering matters. Too much water and the roots rot, too little, and the flowers don't develop properly. Some seasons everything goes right, Takat says wistfully. The Nile floods at exactly the right level. The weather cooperates, the plants thrive, and we produce enough lily perfume to last the temple all year with surplus to sell. Those are the good years, when I remember why I chose this work. Other seasons locusts arrive, or disease spreads through the lotus pond, or unexpected frost kills the roses, and I question everything. But then spring arrives again, and the first lilies bloom, and I remember, nothing smells like hope the way flowers do. You spend the rest of the morning helping with harvest, cutting lotus stems below the water surface, gathering henna flowers into linen bags, carefully trimming rose blooms while avoiding thorns. Your hands grow fragrant, each finger carrying a different scent, and by midday you've become a walking advertisement for the garden's diversity. When you finally leave, Takat presses a small lily bulb into your hand. "Plant this in your own space," she says. "Even perfume workers deserve beauty they don't have to sell." You're sitting across from an elderly physician named Panhazi, who's explaining something that sounds halfway between medicine and magic, though he insists there's no meaningful distinction between the two. His workspace smells like a perfume shop mixed with an apothecary. Jars of dried herbs line the walls, bowls of ground minerals sit on tables, and everywhere the competing scents of myrrh, cassia, juniper, and things you can't immediately identify. He's just told you that perfume isn't merely decorative or religious, it's therapeutic, capable of treating everything from headaches to plague, and he has centuries of medical tradition backing his claims. You're skeptical, but you're also here to learn, so you keep your doubts to yourself and listen. The nose is a pathway to the brain and lungs, Panhisi says, gesturing with hands that shake slightly from age but move with confidence when handling his materials. What you smell affects how you think, how you feel, even how your body functions. This isn't belief or superstition, it's observable reality. I've seen patients with crushing headaches find relief from lotus oil pressed to their temples. I've watched anxious people calm when exposed to Kai-Fi smoke. I've treated women whose monthly bleeding causes terrible pain, and myrrh paste applied to the abdomen helps more reliably than any other remedy. Here's what the medical papyri tell us. Ancient Egyptian physicians prescribed perfumes and aromatic substances for an astonishing range of conditions. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest preserved medical texts, contains over 700 remedies, and fragrant substances appear in hundreds of them. Myrrh is prescribed for wounds, coughs, and digestive complaints. Frankincense treats respiratory problems, arthritis, and depression. Cinnamon addresses fever and improves circulation. Modern research has actually confirmed antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties in many of these substances, suggesting that Egyptian physicians weren't just making things up. They'd identified genuinely therapeutic materials through trial and error over many generations. Panhisi shows you a clay jar containing a dark, sticky substance that smells medicinal and slightly unpleasant. This is myrrh mixed with honey and wine, aged for 40 days, he explains. We prescribe it for liver ailments, mixing a small amount in beer and having the patient drink it daily. Does it cure liver disease? Probably not completely. But patients report feeling better, their pain decreases, sometimes swelling reduces. Whether that's the myrrh acting on the liver directly, or the pleasant taste encouraging them to drink more fluids, or simply the comfort of receiving treatment, does it matter if the outcome is positive? You recognize the philosophical sophistication in his approach. He's not claiming miracles or perfect understanding. He's acknowledging uncertainty while insisting on practical results. This feels more honest than physicians who claim absolute knowledge, and you respect him for it. What about perfumes for mental distress, you ask, thinking of the women you've seen at temple, their prayers thick with unnamed sadness. Ah, now that's where perfume truly shines, Panhisi says, his eyes lighting up. The melancholy that follows childbirth, when a woman should feel joy but instead feels only emptiness. Lotus and rose oil, applied daily, inhaled deeply. Does it cure the condition? No, but it helps. The grief after losing a loved one, when food tastes like dust and sleep won't come. Kefi burned in the evening, creating ritual and comfort through scent. The anxiety that makes the heart race and breath come short. Lavender, though we don't grow it locally, we import it at great expense because it works so reliably. Here's the quirky detail that modern researchers find fascinating. Egyptian medical texts sometimes prescribe perfumes not to be inhaled, but to be worn in small pouches around the neck, supposedly releasing their therapeutic properties gradually throughout the day. These scent amulets contained mixtures of ground aromatics chosen for specific conditions. A child with chronic cough might wear frankincense and pine resin. A woman suffering repeated miscarriages might wear myrrh and juniper. Whether these worked through actual aromatic delivery, placebo effect, or pure faith is impossible to determine at this distance. but patients clearly valued them enough that the practice persisted across centuries. Panacea prepares a remedy while you watch, and his movements have the quality of ritual. Precise measurements, specific grinding techniques, prayers muttered under his breath while mixing. He's making an inhalation treatment for someone with persistent lung congestion. Frankincense and myrrh ground together, mixed with a tiny amount of natron salt, the whole thing to be burned while the patient leans over the smoke with a cloth draped over their head, breathing deeply. The warmth helps, he says. The moisture helps, but mostly the frankincense helps. It loosens phlegm, opens airways, reduces inflammation. We've used this treatment for longer than anyone can remember, and it works more often than not. Historians still argue about how much Egyptian medical knowledge was based on genuine therapeutic understanding versus magical thinking. The medical texts contain legitimate observations mixed with supernatural explanations. A remedy might correctly identify that myrrh helps wounds heal, while incorrectly attributing the healing to myrrh driving out demons. Modern scholars try to separate the rational from the religious, but the Egyptians themselves wouldn't have recognized that distinction. Medicine and magic were the same practice, and a remedy worked because of both its physical properties and its ability to invoke divine assistance. You ask Panacea about the most unusual perfume prescription he's ever given. He thinks for a moment, then laughs, a dry sound like papyrus rustling. A wealthy merchant came to me complaining he couldn't perform his husbandly duties with his young wife. Nothing worked. His body simply refused. I gave him a mixture of cardamom, cinnamon, and a tiny amount of crocodile musk. Told him to apply it to to the relevant area, before attempting relations. 2 months later he returned to thank me, said his wife was pregnant. Was it the perfume that restored his function, or was it the confidence of using an expensive treatment, or did time simply heal whatever was wrong? I have no idea, but he paid me generously, and his wife sent me a beautiful shawl, so everyone was satisfied. This story makes you smile, but it also illustrates something important about perfume medicine. The line between physical and psychological effects is blurry and maybe irrelevant. If smelling rose oil makes a headache disappear, does it matter whether the effect is real or just psychological? The pain is gone either way. If carrying a scent amulet reduces a child's nightmares, should anyone care whether that's pharmacology or placebo? The nightmares have stopped, and that's what matters. Panacea shows you his most prized possession, a section of papyrus containing a perfume formula supposedly created by Imhotep himself, the legendary physician and architect who lived more than 1,000 years ago and was later deified for his wisdom. Whether the attribution is genuine or not, the formula is complex and expensive. 13 ingredients including gold powder, which seems excessive but which Panacea swears is essential. This perfume treats diseases of the mind, he says reverently, the kind where people lose touch with reality, hear voices that aren't there, believe impossible things. I've only made it 3 times in my entire career. The ingredients are too costly for regular use, but all 3 patients showed improvement. You wonder what modern medicine would make of all this. The prescriptions mix genuine therapeutic compounds with pure superstition, keen observation with magical thinking, pragmatic empiricism with religious devotion. But maybe that mixture is precisely what makes it work, at least in a culture where separating physical from spiritual would feel like a category error. People are whole beings, not just bodies, and treatments that address both physical symptoms and spiritual distress probably succeed more often than those targeting only one dimension. Before you leave, Panacea prepares a small vial for you. lotus oil mixed with frankincense. He says it helps with concentration and mental clarity, perfect for someone learning a demanding craft. You accept it gratefully, touched by the gesture. That evening you apply a drop to your temples before studying perfume formulas, and whether because of the oil or simple focused attention, the complex recipes seem clearer, more comprehensible. Maybe Panacea is right about everything. Or maybe belief itself is the most powerful medicine, and perfume just makes belief easier. You're reading a papyrus that makes you blush, though you're trying to maintain a professional demeanour while Marriott watches with obvious amusement. The document is called The Instructions of Ankshashonki, according to the title, though this particular section reads less like wise instructions and more like a practical guide to seduction through strategic scent application. Apply perfume where you want his attention to linger, one passage suggests with admirable directness. Another recommends specific fragrances for different stages of courtship. Lotus for first meetings, suggesting freshness and possibility. Rose for established attraction, promising romance. Myrrh mixed with cardamom for intimate encounters, speaking of depth and lasting commitment. The ancient Egyptians apparently believed that seduction was a skill requiring study, and perfume was among the most powerful tools in the seducer's arsenal. Every culture has these texts, Marriott says, taking the papyrus back and rolling it carefully. Instructions on attraction, on maintaining desire, on winning back straying affection. The Egyptians just happened to be unusually honest about the mechanics of it. We don't pretend love is purely spiritual, or that physical attraction doesn't matter. Of course it matters, and of course you can influence it through strategic use of fragrance, cosmetics, and clothing. Why wouldn't you use every advantage available? Here's what the historical evidence shows. Ancient Egyptian love poetry and instructional texts frequently mention perfume as an essential element of seduction. The Chester Beatty Papyrus contains love poems where lovers describe each other's scent in elaborate detail. Her breath is sweeter than lotus flowers. When he approaches, I smell myrrh, and my heart rejoices. These aren't just poetic flourishes. They're describing real courtship practices where both men and women perfume themselves carefully before romantic encounters, choosing scents designed to communicate specific intentions and evoke particular responses. But the seduction manual Marriott has shown you goes beyond simple perfume application. It contains sophisticated psychology about scent and attraction. One section explains that familiarity breeds comfort, so if you want someone to associate you with positive feelings, you should wear the same perfume consistently until that scent becomes linked in their mind with your presence. Another passage suggests varying your scent based on the lover's mood. Calming fragrances like lotus when they're stressed, energizing ones like cinnamon when they're tired, seductive combinations when the moment seems ripe for intimacy. It's manipulative, certainly, but also pragmatic in a way you can't help but admire. Do women actually follow these instructions, you ask, genuinely curious? The text assumes a level of calculation that feels at odds with romantic spontaneity, though maybe spontaneity is overrated when marriages often serve political and economic purposes rather than pure affection. The smart ones do, Marriott says without hesitation. Marriage is a negotiation that continues for life. Sexual attraction fades, that's just reality. But you can extend it, maintain it longer through conscious effort. Perfume helps. So do other things, staying interesting, managing household competently, choosing your battles wisely. But perfume gives you an advantage. Men are simple in some ways. Their noses lead them places their minds might not choose. Use that knowledge wisely, and you can maintain influence long after youth fades. Here's the quirky detail that often surprises people. The seduction manuals weren't written only for women. Separate texts provided advice for men attempting to attract or maintain female interest, and perfume featured prominently in those instructions too. Men were advised to oil their bodies until they gleamed, to perfume their beards with cedar or myrrh, to ensure their breath didn't offend by chewing fresh mint or fennel seeds before intimate conversation. Egyptian culture expected both genders to present themselves attractively, and perfume was considered basic grooming rather than exclusively feminine decoration. Marriott pulls out another document, this one more explicitly focused on marital sexuality. It recommends that couples create a signature scent together, something neither wears independently, but both apply before lovemaking, training their bodies to associate that particular fragrance with sexual pleasure. Over time, merely smelling that scent, even in non-sexual contexts, would trigger arousal and desire, maintaining passion in long marriages that might otherwise grow stale. You're impressed by the psychological sophistication of this advice, the understanding that desire can be conditioned and reinforced through sensory association. Does it work, you ask, because you genuinely want to know? The theory sounds plausible, but you're skeptical that reality matches these elegant prescriptions. Sometimes, Marriott admits. More often than doing nothing, certainly. But perfume isn't magic. It can't create attraction where none exists. Can't salvage marriages broken by cruelty or betrayal. It's a tool, and like any tool, its effectiveness depends on the skill of the user and the situation where it's applied. A woman married to a man who fundamentally doesn't respect her. No amount of perfume will fix that. But a couple who genuinely care for each other and want to maintain passion, despite the grinding realities of daily life, perfume can help with that. Historians still argue about whether these seduction texts represent actual practice or idealized fantasy. Were Egyptian women really this calculated about attraction, or are we reading too much sophistication into documents that might have been entertainment rather than instruction? The archaeological evidence is ambiguous. We find perfume containers in tombs belonging to both men and women, elaborate cosmetic sets that suggest serious attention to appearance, but we can't know the thoughts and intentions behind their use. Still, the sheer number of texts addressing strategic attraction suggests this was at least a recognized concept, something people discussed and perhaps attempted even if they didn't always succeed. Marriott shows you specific perfume formulas associated with seduction. Not temple recipes, but commercial products sold in markets, advertised with winking promises about their effects on romantic prospects. One called Hatha's Blessing supposedly made the wearer irresistible to potential lovers. Another named the Pharaoh's Favourite claimed to have been used by royal concubines to maintain the king's interest despite competition from dozens of other women. Whether these actually worked better than generic perfumes, or if the marketing itself was the active ingredient, the confidence boost from wearing something guaranteed to attract, you can't determine. But people bought them, repeatedly, which suggests either success or eternal optimism. The most important lesson, Marriott says, tapping the papyrus for emphasis, is that attraction requires attention. You can't neglect your appearance, stop making effort, and expect desire to persist on its own. Men and women both need to feel pursued, valued, worth the trouble of perfuming yourself before bed despite being exhausted. The couples who stay passionate. They're the ones who never stop courting each other, who treat marriage like an ongoing seduction rather than a completed conquest. You think about Isette, the woman whose custom perfume you helped prepare, and wonder if she read texts like this before commissioning her order. Probably she did. Women facing the threat of a younger competition must become students of attraction, learning everything available about maintaining desire. It's sad in some ways, the pressure to remain desirable, the fear of being replaced, but also pragmatic. Better to work with reality than pretend it doesn't exist. Before you leave, Marriott makes you promise something. If you marry, she says, remember that perfume should be mutual. Don't just wear it for your husband. Encourage him to wear it for you. Don't just use it for seduction. Use it for comfort, for joy, for marking good memories. The couples who survive longest treat perfume as a shared language, not a weapon one partner wields against the other. Makes sense? You promise. Though marriage feels distant and theoretical at this point in your life, still, the advice feels sound, applicable beyond just romantic relationships. Perfume as shared experience rather than manipulation, as communication rather than control. That resonates with you. That night, you apply a bit of lotus oil, not for anyone else but for yourself, because it makes you feel present in your own skin, alive to sensation, worthy of beauty even when no one else is watching. You're crouched in the shadows of a workshop you're not supposed to be near, watching a transaction that will probably get someone killed if discovered. The perfumer, a nervous man named Jehuti whose hands shake as he works, is carefully pouring amber liquid from an unmarked clay jar into a smaller container while his customer watches with predatory intensity. You know what's happening because Marriott warned you about situations exactly like this. Someone is buying a forbidden royal perfume formula, probably intending to sell it as authentic palace product, or use it to impersonate status they don't possess. The financial reward must be enormous to justify the risk because discovery means execution, not just for Jehuti but potentially for his entire family. You shouldn't be here. You were running an errand for Marriott when you noticed Jehuti slipping into this abandoned workshop, followed shortly by a wealthy-looking man whose face you half recognize from temple ceremonies. Curiosity pulled you closer, and now you're trapped. Leaving might draw attention, staying means witnessing a crime you'll be obligated to report or become complicit in through silence. The ethical calculations make your head hurt. Jehuti is a colleague, part of your professional community, but he's also committing a capital offense, stealing formulas that belong to the pharaoh, undermining the cosmic order that keeps Egyptian society functioning. Here's what the historical records tell us about perfume espionage. It was real, it was dangerous, and it happened more frequently than official sources acknowledge. Temple archives occasionally reference investigations into stolen formulas, perfumers who disappeared under suspicious circumstances, and security measures designed to prevent recipe theft. The palace employed perfumers who swore loyalty oaths and worked in isolation, their movements restricted to prevent them from sharing knowledge with outsiders. Despite these precautions, formulas leaked. Rival temples bribed perfumers for their secrets. Foreign merchants paid fortunes for Egyptian perfume recipes, and some perfumers, tempted by wealth or coerced by threats, betrayed their oaths and sold knowledge that wasn't theirs to sell. The customer hands Jehuti a small leather pouch, payment obviously, and Jehuti weighs it briefly before tucking it into his belt. You understand the risk, Jehuti whispers, his voice barely audible. If anyone discovers you wearing this scent, they'll investigate. You need a plausible story about how you obtained it. Say you inherited it from a relative who served in the palace, or you found it in an old market stall. Never admit you commissioned it. The customer nods impatiently. I know the risks. That's why I'm paying you enough to live comfortably for 3 years. Just make sure the formula is exact. If it smells wrong, if palace officials notice discrepancies, I'll make sure they know exactly where it came from." It's a threat, clear and cold, and you see Jehuti flinch. He's trapped in a situation with no good outcomes. Betray his oath and hope to escape detection, or refuse payment and risk the customer reporting him for even discussing forbidden formulas. This is what happens when laws are enforced through execution rather than proportional punishment. The stakes become so high that everyone involved has incentive to escalate rather than retreat. Here's the quirky detail that rarely makes it into formal histories. Some perfumers deliberately sabotage stolen formulas, including one ingredient that would smell correct initially, but would turn rancid or develop unpleasant notes after a few days. This protected them in multiple ways. If caught, they could claim they never provided the real formula, just a decoy. And if not caught, the customer would learn too late that they'd been cheated, likely after already wearing the perfume in public and embarrassing themselves. It was a risky strategy, but some perfumers considered it preferable to genuine betrayal while still collecting payment. You watch Jehuti seal the container with beeswax, his hands steadier now that the transaction is nearly complete. He presses his seal into the wax. Foolish, leaving evidence. But the customer probably demanded proof of authenticity. The customer tucks the perfume into his robes and leaves without another word, moving quickly but trying not to appear rushed. Jehuti stands alone in the workshop for a long moment, and you can see him second-guessing everything. The decision to steal the formula, the choice to deal with this particular customer, the entire trajectory of choices that led to this moment. Then he notices you. His face goes white, then red, emotions flickering too rapidly to track. "How long have you been there?" he asks, and there's desperation in his voice that makes you sad despite everything. "Long enough," you admit, because lying seems pointless. "What formula did you give him?" "Queen Tier's rose blend," he says quietly. "The one she wore during state ceremonies. It's been decades since she died. I thought maybe the restrictions would have relaxed. But no, it's still listed as forbidden property of the royal house." He looks at you pleadingly. "What are you going to do?" Historians still argue about how extensively palace officials actually monitored perfume use among the population. Were there really perfume police sniffing everyone at public events, ready to arrest anyone wearing royal scents? Or was enforcement more sporadic, triggered by specific complaints or political motivations? The severity of the laws suggests serious enforcement, but the number of recorded cases is surprisingly small. Perhaps most violations went undetected. Perhaps officials only prosecuted when convenient, or when dealing with political enemies who needed convenient charges levelled against them. You face an impossible choice. Report Jehuti, and you'll be responsible for his execution and the destruction of his family. Stay silent and you're complicit in undermining royal authority and religious law. There's no middle ground, no compromise position that preserves both your integrity and his life. This is why Mariette warned you about getting involved in situations like this. There are no good answers, only degrees of bad. "Who was the customer?" you ask, stalling while you think. "A mid-level official in the Treasury," Jehuti says. "He wants to smell like royalty at court functions, thinks it'll help his career. Probably it will, until someone notices and asks uncomfortable questions. Then we're both dead, and his career advancement becomes irrelevant." You realize that Jehuti has essentially committed suicide on the installment plan. The customer will wear the perfume publicly. That's the entire point of buying it. Someone will notice. Investigations will follow. The trail will lead back to Jehuti, and then interrogations, confessions extracted through methods you don't want to imagine, and finally execution. The money he received buys him maybe a few months of comfortable living before everything collapses. You need to leave Thebes, you say finally. Take your family and go somewhere remote where no one knows your name or specialty. Change professions. Become a farmer or fisherman or anything except a perfumer. The customer will be caught eventually, and when he is, you don't want to be findable. Jehuti stares at you like you've suggested he grow wings and fly to the moon. Leave Thebes? Leave everything I've built? I've been perfuming for 20 years. It's all I know. Then you'll die for it, you say bluntly. Maybe in 3 months, maybe in 6, but certainly. Is 20 years of career worth ending your life and destroying your family? He doesn't answer, just sinks down to sit on the workshop floor, head in his hands. You leave him there, walking back toward the temple through streets that suddenly feel dangerous, filled with people making choices that will kill them, selling pieces of their future for temporary comfort or status. You don't report Jehuti, but you don't protect him either. You simply continue your life and wait to see what happens, knowing that some disasters can be predicted but not prevented. 3 months later, you hear that Jehuti has disappeared. No official investigation, no public execution, just gone. Either he took your advice and fled, or someone made him disappear for reasons unrelated to the perfume theft. Or perhaps the customer was caught and eliminated before he could implicate anyone else. You'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. You're in a different kind of workshop now, one that smells less exotic and more familiar. Not the complex layers of temple incense or noble perfumes, but simpler scents that speak of ordinary life. This is where common people come for their perfume needs. A small market stall run by a woman named Henut, who has no formal training from temples, but who's learned her craft through family tradition and trial and error experimentation. Her customers can't afford frankincense from Punt or roses from Syria. They need affordable fragrances that mask the smells of daily labour, sweat and fish and onions and the ever-present mud of the Nile, without bankrupting families who measure wealth in loaves of bread rather than gold rings. Henut is showing you her inventory with obvious pride despite its humble origins. Clay pots of palm oil infused with crushed marigolds, their scent bright and cheerful if not particularly sophisticated. Bundles of dried lavender imported cheaply because it's last season's harvest. Slightly faded but still fragrant enough for practical purposes. Small cakes of scented fat made with tallow and whatever aromatic plants grow wild near the city. Mint, thyme, chamomile. Things that don't require expensive cultivation or dangerous trade routes. The rich get myrrh and lotus, Henut says with a shrug that suggests she's made peace with economic reality. Everyone else gets creativity and compromise. Here's what the archaeological evidence shows. Perfume use wasn't limited to temples and palaces. Even modest homes contained small perfume containers, usually simple clay vessels rather than elaborate alabaster, but perfume nonetheless. Analysis of residue from these common containers shows plant-based fragrances using locally available materials, herbs from kitchen gardens, flowers that grew wild, oils pressed from seeds and nuts. The poor couldn't afford imported aromatics, but they still wanted to smell pleasant, still participated in the cultural practice of perfuming themselves for festivals, marriages, funerals, and ordinary social interactions. Henut's bestseller, she tells you, is something she calls river blessing, palm oil infused with crushed lotus petals that she collects herself from the Nile's edges, where the flowers grow wild and free rather than in cultivated temple ponds. Same flower the rich use, she says, just gathered differently. The scent isn't quite as pure and it doesn't last as long because I can't afford the best carrier oils. But it's lotus, genuine lotus, and my customers can afford it. They wear it to temple festivals and feel, for a few hours, like they're not so different from the nobles. You watch her work, grinding dried marigold petals with a mortar and pestle that's seen better decades. The stone worn smooth and cracked in places but still functional. Her technique is less refined than what you learned in the temple. She grinds coarser, doesn't strain as carefully, accepts imperfections that Marriott would never tolerate. But she works with confidence born from knowing her customers and their needs. A fisherman's wife doesn't need perfume that lasts 12 hours. She needs something affordable that will smell nice at her daughter's wedding and can be stretched across multiple uses. Henut understands this implicitly. Here's the quirky detail. Some of Henut's formulas would horrify temple perfumers, not because they don't work, but because they use ingredients considered too common or spiritually inappropriate. She makes a popular perfume using onion flowers. Yes, onion flowers, which surprisingly have a lovely subtle scent when properly processed. Temple perfumers would never use onion in perfume because onions are associated with poverty and base sustenance, lacking the spiritual elevation required for sacred work. But Henut's customers don't care about spiritual associations. They care that onion flowers grow abundantly in their gardens and produce acceptable fragrance for free. Do temple perfumers ever visit your stall, you ask, curious about the relationship between elite and common perfumery? Henut laughs, a sound that's more tired than amused. They pretend we don't exist. To them, what I do isn't real perfumery. It's just peasants mixing smelly things together. But you know what's funny? Sometimes servants from wealthy houses come here buying perfume for themselves, and they tell me stories. Their mistresses use imported frankincense and rose oil, costing more than a month's wages. But after a full day of wearing it, after sweat and heat and normal life, it smells not that different from my palm oil and marigold blend. Expensive perfume is about the first hour, the announcement of wealth. My perfumes are about the 5th hour, about still smelling acceptable when you're tired and it's hot and you've been working. The observation strikes you as profound. Temple perfumery is about peak experience, the moment of application, the initial impression, the expensive burst of fragrance that announces status and devotion. But most of life happens hours after application, when expensive ingredients have faded, and what remains is base notes and stay in power. Maybe there's wisdom in Henut's approach, in creating perfumes designed for endurance rather than spectacle. Historians still argue about what percentage of the Egyptian population regularly used perfume. Some scholars suggest it was nearly universal, pointing to how many surviving texts discuss perfume, and how perfume containers appear even in modest burials. Others argue that archaeological evidence overrepresents the wealthy whose tombs preserved better, and that most common people used perfume rarely, if at all. The truth probably varies by region, period, and individual circumstances, but workshops like Henut's suggest there was definitely a market for affordable perfume, meaning demand extended beyond just the elite. You help Henut prepare her marigold oil, learning techniques that differ from temple methods, but achieve similar results with inferior materials. She doesn't have the luxury of replacing flowers daily to maximize scent absorption. Instead, she uses the same flowers for multiple infusions, squeezing every possible drop of fragrance from them before discarding. She can't afford to waste anything. Even the spent flower petals get composted and used to fertilize her small herb garden, which produces next season's raw materials. It's perfumery as survival strategy. Every component utilized fully, nothing taken for granted. A customer arrives, a young woman, pregnant and glowing, looking for something special for her upcoming wedding, She has limited money, counting out small copper pieces carefully, but she wants to smell beautiful on her important day. Heinert listens to her story with genuine attention, asks questions about the wedding location and time of day, considers the woman's natural scent and colouring. Then she creates a custom blend on the spot, mixing palm oil with dried lavender, a touch of mint for freshness, and a tiny amount of honey for sweetness. The result isn't complex or particularly long-lasting, but it's lovely in its simplicity, and the young woman's face lights up when she smells it. That's the real reward, Heinert tells you after the customer leaves. Not gold, not prestige, not having your formulas carved in temple walls, just seeing someone feel beautiful who couldn't afford to feel that way otherwise. Temple perfumers serve gods and pharaohs. I serve people who smell like work and worry, and I help them smell like something else, even if just for a few hours. Tell me honestly, which matters more? You don't answer because you can't. Both matter. The sacred and the common, the expensive and the affordable. The perfumes that carry prayers to gods and the perfumes that simply make difficult lives slightly more bearable. They're all part of the same tradition, the same human impulse to make the world smell better than it naturally does, to claim beauty even in poverty, to insist that fragrance isn't only for the wealthy, but belongs to everyone who desires it. Before you leave, Heinert gives you a small pot of her marigold oil. For remembering where perfume comes from, she says, not from temples or palaces, but from regular people wanting to smell like hope. You accept it gratefully, knowing you'll treasure it more than many of the expensive oils in Mariette's workshop, because it represents something important that temple training sometimes forgets. Perfume is fundamentally democratic, available to anyone with flowers and oil and the desire to transform them into beauty. You're standing in what will eventually become a legend, though you don't know it yet. A small perfume workshop in Alexandria, the new capital built by the Greeks who now rule Egypt after Alexander swept through and changed everything. The city feels different from Thebes, more cosmopolitan, filled with foreigners speaking languages you don't understand, trading goods from places you've never heard of. But perfume remains perfume, and you're here because Mariette arranged for you to meet a Greek perfumer named Megacles, who claims to have invented something revolutionary. Perfume stored in glass bottles rather than clay or alabaster, sealed so tightly that fragrance can't escape even after years of storage. Megacles holds up a small glass bottle, and sunlight streams through it, turning the amber liquid inside into liquid gold. The Egyptians taught us about perfume, he says in heavily accented Egyptian. But we Greeks are improving the technology. Glass doesn't absorb scent like clay does. It doesn't react with ingredients the way some metals do. It's transparent so customers can see exactly what they're buying. And, most importantly, it can be sealed perfectly, allowing perfumes to age and develop complexity the way wine does. You're skeptical but intrigued. Glass is expensive, fragile, and still relatively rare despite the workshops that have sprung up in Alexandria. Using it for perfume storage seems extravagant, wasteful even. But when Megacles opens the bottle and lets you smell the contents, a complex blend of rose, cinnamon, and something woody you can't quite identify, you understand immediately. The scent is pristine, perfectly preserved, showing no signs of oxidation or degradation despite Megacles claiming the bottle was sealed over a year ago. In clay containers, perfume this old would have changed significantly. Some notes fading, while others became unpleasantly prominent. But this smells fresh, balanced, exactly as intended. Here's what the historical record shows. The Greeks and later the Romans transformed Egyptian perfume technology, in ways that would define perfumery for millennia. Glass bottles became standard for high-quality perfumes, allowing for better preservation and more elaborate presentations. Greek perfumers began experimenting with alcohol-based perfumes rather than oil-based ones, though this technology wouldn't fully mature until Islamic scholars perfected distillation centuries later. Most significantly, they commercialized perfume on an unprecedented scale, creating trade networks that carried Egyptian-style perfumes throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Megacles shows you his workshop, which combines Egyptian techniques with Greek innovations. He uses traditional Egyptian ingredients, lotus from the Nile, myrrh from Punt, cinnamon from distant eastern lands, but processes them differently. Where Egyptian perfumers typically create heavy oil-based unguents, Megacles experiments with lighter formulations, mixing perfume oils with wine or vinegar to create products that can be sprayed or splashed rather than carefully applied with fingers. "The future of perfume is convenience," he says confidently. "People want luxury that's easy to use, that doesn't require ritual or extensive preparation. They want to smell good quickly, then get on with their lives." You find his attitude both innovative and slightly sad. Egyptian perfumery has always been about ritual, about the slow, meditative process of application, about treating fragrance as something sacred requiring attention and respect. Megacles wants to strip away that ceremonial aspect to make perfume as casual as eating bread. You understand the commercial logic: more customers, more sales, more profit. But something feels lost in the translation. Here's the quirky detail that connects ancient and modern perfumery. Those Greek glass bottles that Megacles is so proud of. They were the direct ancestors of modern perfume bottles. Archaeological excavations throughout the Mediterranean have found thousands of these ancient glass perfume containers, some still sealed, a few even retaining traces of fragrance after 2,000 years. Chemical analysis of these residues has allowed modern perfumers to recreate ancient formulas with surprising accuracy, creating a direct link between Egyptian temple perfumers and contemporary French perfume houses. The techniques changed, the materials evolved, but the fundamental goal remained constant: capturing beauty in a bottle. Megacles demonstrates his newest innovation, a perfume designed to smell different depending on skin temperature and chemistry. The Egyptians knew that perfume changes on skin, he explains, but they couldn't predict or control how. "I've created formulas with multiple layers of scent that reveal themselves sequentially as the perfume warms and interacts with body oils. The first hour you smell lotus, the second hour rose emerges. By evening you're wearing primarily myrrh with just hints of the earlier notes. It's 3 perfumes in one, evolving throughout the day." You're genuinely impressed despite your reservations about Greek commercialism. This is sophisticated work, showing deep understanding of perfume chemistry even if Megacles doesn't use that terminology. The Egyptians knew that scent evolved over time, but generally treated it as something to be minimized or controlled rather than deliberately designed. Megacles is embracing the evolution, making it a feature rather than a problem to be solved. Historians still argue about whether Greek perfumery represented genuine innovation or simply better marketing of Egyptian techniques. The Greeks certainly didn't invent perfume. Egyptian perfumers had been working for thousands of years before Greeks showed any interest. But the Greeks systematized production, created international trade networks, and ultimately spread Egyptian perfume technology throughout the ancient world in ways that Egyptians, who tended toward cultural insularity, never managed. Was this progress or appropriation? Innovation or theft? Probably both, depending on perspective and what aspects you emphasize. You spend the afternoon learning Greek perfume techniques, and you're surprised by how much common ground exists despite apparent differences. Megacles grinds resins the same way you learned in the temple. He tests scent combinations on his own skin before finalizing formulas. He understands that perfume creation requires patience, precision, and willingness to fail repeatedly before achieving something worth preserving. The tools differ, the bottles are fancier, the marketing more aggressive, but the fundamental craft remains recognizable. Before you leave Alexandria to return to Thebes, Megacles gives you several glass bottles to take back to Mariette. "Show these to the temple perfumers," he says. "Tell them the future is arriving whether they're ready or not. Egyptian perfume techniques are spreading across the world, carried by Greek merchants and Roman soldiers. Within a few generations, every major city from Spain to India will have perfumers trained in methods that originated here in Egypt. Your legacy isn't staying in temples, it's becoming global. That should make you proud." You carry the glass bottles carefully, wrapped in linen to prevent breakage, and you think about legacy and change and what it means when knowledge travels beyond its place of origin. Part of you resents Greek appropriation of Egyptian perfumery, the way they take credit for innovations they merely commercialized rather than invented. But another part recognizes that knowledge wants to spread, that techniques grow stronger through sharing rather than hoarding. That perfume becoming global means Egyptian wisdom touching lives across the entire known world. When you show the bottles to Mariette, she examines them with the careful attention she brings to everything, turning them in the light, testing their seals, smelling the contents. "Beautiful work," she admits finally. "The Greeks have talent, I'll give them that. But remember something important. They learned from us. Every technique they use, every formula they celebrate, originated in Egyptian temples and workshops. They may improve the presentation, but we created the foundation. Never forget where you come from, even as you watch the world change around you." You promise to remember, and you do, carrying that knowledge forward through years of perfume work, through the continued Greek influence and eventual Roman conquest, through all the changes that sweep over Egypt like Nile floods, transforming everything while somehow leaving essential things unchanged. The perfume persists, the scent remains, the flowers still bloom and give up their fragrance, and human hands still transform that fragrance into something worth preserving. The world grows larger, more connected, more complex. But in quiet workshops throughout Egypt and beyond, perfumers continue the work, grinding resins, macerating flowers, testing combinations, creating beauty from raw materials. Some work in temples, some in market stalls, some in Greek-style workshops with glass bottles and commercial ambitions. But they're all part of the same tradition, the same long conversation about how to capture the invisible and make it tangible, how to transform smell into memory, into meaning. And you, standing between the old Egyptian ways and the new Greek innovations, carry both forward, synthesizing tradition, and change into something that honors the past while embracing the future. The perfume you create contains thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, and it also contains your own innovations, your personal understanding of how scent works and what it can accomplish. You're a link in a chain stretching back to the first person who crushed flowers and noticed they smelled sweeter, and forward to perfumers who won't exist for millennia, but who will still be working with the same basic principles, the same fundamental desire to make the world smell like something better than it naturally does. The night deepens around you now, and perhaps you're feeling drowsy, ready to let these stories of ancient perfume fade into dreams of lotus blossoms and frankincense smoke. The Egyptian perfumers worked their craft thousands of years ago, but their legacy persists in every perfume bottle, every scented candle, every moment when fragrance transforms your mood or unlocks a memory you thought you'd forgotten. They understood something essential about being human, that we're creatures who crave beauty, who find meaning in invisible things, who believe that the right scent at the right moment can change everything. So as you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself walking through those ancient gardens one more time, the sun setting over the Nile, the air thick with competing fragrances, lotus and rose and myrrh all mingling together into something uniquely Egyptian, something that spoke of civilization and devotion and the stubborn insistence that life should smell divine even when it feels ordinary. The perfumers are at rest now, their work complete, their fragrances slowly fading as all fragrances eventually must. But the memory remains, preserved not in bottles, but in stories, in the collective human understanding that scent matters, that beauty is worth pursuing, that the invisible threads connecting flowers to oil, to skin, to memory are sacred in their own quiet way. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere, always, someone is grinding resins and steeping petals and creating fragrances that will outlive them, just as the Egyptian perfumers created scents that reach across millennia to touch us still. The work continues, the perfume persists, and tomorrow the flowers will bloom again, ready to surrender their fragrance to patient hands and ancient knowledge, keeping the tradition alive one precious drop at a time. Sweet dreams.